Pay close attention. The news you're about to see is fulfilling Bible prophecy.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you the news that relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yeshua Hawkins. Well, in the news this week, we're going to talk about Russia is now having plans of helping China to develop their own missile attack warning system, which is essentially strengthening the ties between these two military superpowers. Also, we have Iran's President Hassan Rouhani's latest comments with regards to the U.S. sanctions, which we know the U.S. continues to slap these sanctions on any country that deals with Iran and other countries that are opposed to the U.S. And also, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has a special meeting with the Pope and makes a special request. We'll have those details and more, but first, we're going to talk about schools. Well, schools need to have plans and procedures in place for many different types of emergencies, from a sick or injured child to chemical spills in science class, but also disruptive and even violent students. Room clears, as they're called, have been a standard protocol in many schools to help in all of these situations, but more and more they're being used to deal with out-of-control children.
That's right. When a teacher calls for a room clear, his or her students are supposed to leave their classroom and go to another designated classroom or area in the school while the teacher remains with the student having an issue until help can arrive. Now, many times students who have lost their self-control will start destroying the classroom in their rage. One Des Moines teacher, Ashley May, interviewed by NBC, commented, "I have had my things thrown around the room, ripped off the walls. I've been punched, kicked, and stabbed with a pencil."
Well, May, who quit her job at the end of last school year, said the violent behavior was very common. And what was even more frightening was their age. Her students were just 7 years old.
Wow.
While clearing their classroom seems like a great idea initially and was put into practice as more rules got stricter for teachers using physical restraint on students. So, instead of the teachers jumping in there, they called for these room clears to just leave that student by itself there and hopefully to calm down. But as you can see from some of these pictures, they end up destroying the classrooms.
Wow. But May says it's not fair. It's not fair to anybody. The other students don't get to learn. I can't teach. My stuff's getting destroyed. That student can't learn. While schools do understand the challenges their teachers are facing, they just don't have the funds to meet the demands of problem children. One big issue, they say, is there aren't enough mental health providers for their students. So teachers are caught in the middle in a job they didn't realize they were signing up for when they dreamed about teaching children. Wow.
Well, today's school environment is a cautious one, as Bob Cunningham, who pushes for more education policy at the nonprofit Understood, says. Now, he commented by saying schools have to be much more careful about restraining or removing kids from class. Then one of the sort of simpler things to do is to remove all of the other kids. Now, Cunningham maintains you need to figure out why that kid is acting that way. Behavior, he said, is not accidental. It's a communication method. So in other words, their behavior, that acting out, trying to communicate something they're going through, definitely not the right way to communicate it, but as he said there, you've got to figure out what is going on with that child.
Sure, and a lot of teachers aren't paid to be psychologists or mental health experts, so their hands are kind of up in the air because they can't do anything to restrain the student, and they're not really trained to really get to the source of the problem, to address why the student's acting that way. So they basically are left, as we can see here, to just babysit the child while they destroy the room, hoping that they don't get hurt. Well, teachers like May are hoping the problem will get enough attention that changes can be made. Solutions they have put forth are smaller class sizes, more training for teachers, and more mental health specialists. But of course, all those things cost money and therefore don't seem within any school's reach. It's interesting because it seems like these problems have continually grown worse over the years. I don't remember seeing hardly any outbursts like that when I was going to school many years ago, and it's just progressively gotten worse in the school systems.
Right, they seem so common that, with the teacher May here, that they're quitting their jobs and not really having a career in teaching because they can't handle the stress and the danger there from actually teaching children.
Yeah.
Well, have you ever thought about how close we are to global nuclear disaster should two countries break out into a war and unleash their nuclear weapons? Well, in a candid interview with Al Jazeera, the Pakistani President Imran Khan talks about the idea that if they went to war with India and found themselves in a losing situation, they would not think twice about using their nuclear weapons.
Well, science has proven the effects of such an exchange between India and Pakistan would affect the entire globe, but they are not the only two countries we have to worry about. Let's take a look at this video to see what we have come from and what the new arms race looks like around the world today.
74 years ago, two nuclear bombs were detonated over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing tens of thousands of people. Since then, wherever conflict between major powers rises, so does the threat of nuclear war. Various treaties have attempted to suppress that threat, yet today there are nearly 14,000 nuclear weapons based around the world. Thursday marks the International Day for the total elimination of nuclear weapons, but it's a goal that looks increasingly less likely.
Despite calls for the global reduction in nuclear weapons, it is increasingly clear that a new arms race has begun. Arms agreements made between the United States and the then Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War have eroded in the last few years. The ABM, or Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, was the first to go when the US pulled out in 2002. Next was the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, designed to stop one side from attacking the other by surprise. That collapsed this year after both the US and Russia accused the other of violations. And the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or New START, signed in 2010, looks increasingly unlikely to be renewed when it runs out in 2021. Both Russia and the United States have already begun their nuclear modernization programs, introducing new weapon systems to those they already have. China has never been constrained by treaty limitations and has been expanding its nuclear forces, while North Korea has its own growing stockpile and the increasingly potent means to deliver them. But not all nuclear threats stem from the Cold War. Pakistan and India's nuclear arsenals became an international concern during the recent crisis over Indian-administered Kashmir, while Israel's is believed to be robust and ready for use. The world has become an increasingly dangerous place, and the countries that already possess nuclear weapons have only shown interest in expanding and modernizing their stockpiles. Experts say that makes nuclear conflict more and not less likely in the future.
Is the elimination of nuclear weapons actually achievable in this day and age?
Not under the current political and strategic circumstances, no. There isn't sufficient willingness to jeopardize strategic and alliance positions, and there isn't enough trust to believe that other people would, even if they signed up to a treaty to do so. There is a huge unsolved problem of how you verify and enforce treaties to do with weapons of mass destruction.
Andrew, the bulletin of atomic science's doomsday clock is now set at 2 minutes to midnight. That's the closest it's ever been to nuclear war. So, how dire is the situation right now?
I think it's very concerning, and we have to be very concerned about all signs of a new nuclear arms race, because the results could be absolutely catastrophic. I agree with what Paul just said, that there is not at present the political will for kind of widespread disarmament we want to see. But that's not a reason why that shouldn't be what we're aspiring to going forward, because the risk is very severe. The idea of a nuclear-armed Putin, a nuclear-armed Trump, the greater proliferation of nuclear weapons around the world is something which should concern us all.
Lawrence, are there currently any nuclear disarmament negotiations underway? And at this stage, can diplomacy still work?
Well, it can if both sides are willing, the two major nuclear powers, the United States and Russia. President Putin has offered to extend the New START agreement, which limits each side to 1,550 deployable nuclear weapons for 5 years. Unfortunately, President Trump hasn't taken him up on that. If that expires in 2021, given the fact that the United States has gotten out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement with Russia, and then, of course, gotten out of the nuclear arms agreement with Iran, it looks like we're going in the wrong direction. And nearly, 50 years of progress from the Nixon administration through Obama seem to be going in the other way.
All right, so this discussion has become increasingly relevant given the recent tensions between India and Pakistan over the state of Kashmir. I spoke to Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan about the possibility of a nuclear conflict. Here's what he had to say.
When two nuclear-armed countries fight, if they fight a conventional war, there is every possibility that it's going to end up into nuclear war. The unthinkable. I mean, if say Pakistan, God forbid, we're fighting a conventional war, we're losing, and if a country is stuck between the choice, either you surrender or you fight till death for your freedom. I know Pakistanis will fight to death for their freedom. So when a nuclear-armed country fights to the end, to the death, it has consequences. When a nuclear-armed country fights to the end, to the death, it has consequences. When a nuclear-armed country fights to the end, to the death, it has consequences.
Andrew, let me ask you, when it comes to the potential for nuclear conflict, there is so much concern right now when it comes to Pakistan and India. How worried are you that this could actually happen at some point?
It's something which we should be very worried about, because in any conflict between two nuclear powers, all it takes is one side to press the button, and that could kill tens of thousands of people. And even when we are talking about the limits and the plans for reduction which are being suggested, 1,550 nuclear warheads is still an awful lot of warheads. That could do a huge amount of devastation all around the world.
Lawrence, the U.S. recently withdrew from the INF treaty with Russia. The U.S. has accused Russia of flouting the conditions of the pact. On the other side of that argument, the Russians, President Putin, he said that he believes that the U.S. withdrawal from the agreement has been counterproductive. Is all this going to lead to an actual new arms race between Russia and the U.S.?
Well, it could, because both sides are modernizing their nuclear arsenals. For example, this year in our defense budget, President Trump has asked for what we call a low-yield nuclear weapon, which would have been prohibited under the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement. So there is that danger.
There is growing concern about China's arsenal. Many say that it's not subject to any international arms control treaties. So, first of all, how worrisome is that? And secondly, how large is China's arsenal?
Nobody knows. They refuse to give details. They have a systematic refusal of transparency. So that means you can't even begin to discuss what numerical limitations would look like. I see estimates, it's in the order of 300 to 400. It's certainly growing, but nobody knows. And so there's a practical problem there. There's also a conceptual problem. Nobody has got a convincing model of what the right proportions would be. How many should America have? How many should Russia have? How many should China have? How many should the two European countries, nuclear countries, have? There's no concept of what an equitable global balance would be, even before we begin to think about the non-NPT states, Israel, Pakistan, and India, and what their numbers should be.
Well, some interesting comments that we saw in that interview that most all of the nuclear treaties that were in place have been either dissolved or will be dissolved in a few short years,
Right.
which we see has led to this new arms race. And they've talked about there how the United States and Russia both heavily engaged in developing further development of their nuclear weapons and certain military aspects there. And also, interesting comment that there's no trust between the nations. So even if one would agree to reduce their nuclear weapons, there's no way they could trust another nation to do the same.
That's right. Sad.
Well, as if the trade war between the U.S. and China wasn't enough, now the United States has slapped new sanctions on some Chinese entities. The reasoning behind the sanctions, the U.S. says, is that they knowingly engaged in transporting Iranian oil.
As we reported a few weeks ago, after the drone attacks on the Saudi Aramco oil field, the U.S. has issued sanctions on anyone who might trade with the Iranians who they held responsible for the attack. The U.S. did not limit these sanctions to countries but entities as well. Now, the U.S. believes China has been violating these sanctions, accusing 5 Chinese nationalists and 6 entities, including shipping subsidiaries of Costco.
Well, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, told the United States just the other day, quote, "We're telling China and all nations that we will sanction every violation and we will know about every violation." So basically, Katan, the U.S. is trying to shake down anyone who they believe is working with the Iranians and essentially bullying them into stopping.
The friend of my enemy is not my friend. Yeah. Well, while the U.S. applies maximum pressure, China is unhampered, maintaining that they have a lawful relationship with Iran and actually reject America's efforts to squash that.
Well, the United States President Donald Trump spoke at the 74th UN General Assembly and continued to warn both China and Iran. Now, Larry McGee has been covering this story as well as a few others for us. Larry, what exactly did the president have to say to these two nations, and what if any response has come back so far?
President Trump utilized the 74th session of the UN General Assembly to send warning shots at 2 of America's greatest targets, Iran and China. With a calm and measured delivery that analysts are calling an interesting change of style, the president called out Beijing for allegedly failing to adopt promised reforms. Far from being an innocent victim and a friendly economic alternative, President Trump laid bare the moving parts of China's art of war-inspired economic model, which he says includes market barriers, heavy state subsidies, currency manipulation, product dumping, forced technology transfers, and the theft of intellectual property and trade secrets on a grand scale. On Tehran, the president stated that as long as it continues to display behavior that America considers menacing, then American sanctions will tighten and not loosen. President Trump stated that if the leadership of the Persian people are not careful, then Iran will be reduced to a cautionary tale of what takes place when leaders abandon their people and embark on what he called a crusade geared towards the acquisition of personal power and riches. For Iran's part, however, it is the United States who are the crusaders, wielding, chopping, and cutting with the petrodollar and economic sanctions as opposed to the handheld sword. President Rouhani stated at a recent gathering that the weaponization of the U.S. dollar has produced economic terrorism. The Iranian leader, who was speaking at the Eurasian Economic Union Summit, asserted that U.S. sanctions are targeted at civilians. Mr. Rouhani also welcomed the opportunity to join the union, which would put it in official league with Russia, Armenia, and a number of other nations. The Persian head stated that he believed that such agreements are key opportunities for the economic integrity of the region amid instability between the participating nations brought on by U.S. trade restrictions. In response to the current administration's international call to arms against Tehran, Iran itself is instead calling on the international community to take collective measures and fight the menace of U.S. unilateralism. For YPN News, I'm Larry McGee. Katan Jeff, back to you.
Well, Iran's definitely making it clear that they want their voice to be heard and that they're also not going to just allow themselves to be continually walked all over. Well, Mike Pompeo met with Sergei Lavrov at the recent UN General Assembly meeting, the first meeting for the two since last May. This after more sanctions levied on Russian entities, for fuel cells to Syria. The U.S. has said that Russia is supporting Assad's brutal war machine in Syria. Well, these sanctions are on one Russian company, 5 Russian flag vessels, and 3 Russian individuals for the facilitating of the transfer of jet fuel to Syria. Now, this is interestingly the 75th round of sanctions that have been taken against Russia since 2011.
75 different sanctions. That's a lot.
It sure is.
Well, the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said that these sanctions placed against Russia is absolutely useless, and he sees this as just the latest steps of the U.S. acting unilaterally when it should be acting multilaterally, and that he thinks that the international community is on its way to a more just system because of the arrogant neo-colonial policies that are being used by the United States, and that's what's being used to empower certain countries to impose their will on others. So basically, Catan condemning the rhetoric by the U.S.
Right. Well, regarding the war in Syria, the U.S. and Russia have opposing policies as to why they're involved in the conflict. The U.S. says it's only there to fight Islamic extremism, while Russia, on the other hand, sees their fight against international terrorism in Syria.
Well, the Vatican hosted a U.S. Holy See collaborated event to promote religious freedom called Pathways to Human Dignity. Now, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo flew to Rome to participate. The event tackled how to combat human trafficking and provide humanitarian assistance worldwide. Now, global ambassadors were present, including U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See, Callista Gingrich.
Pompeo lamented that 80% of mankind worldwide they live in places where religious freedom is threatened. Pompeo said, "Today, each of us must gird ourselves for another battle in defense of human dignity and religious freedom. The stakes today are arguably higher than during the Cold War because the threats to it are more diverse and numerous." Well, regarding China, Pompeo said, "When the state rules absolutely, God becomes an absolute threat to authority."
Well, Pompeo called on Cuba, Iran, Pakistan, and Myanmar. He closed by saying, "We humbly ask the Holy See to join us and the representatives of all nations to join us. What could be more powerful," he said, "than our voices all together calling for freedom to worship God?"
Interesting. Well, it does seem, by these meetings that they're having and of course, as many say, the rhetoric that we see taking place between the nations, and even just going back to the very beginning report that we had on the schools. I mean, organizations, governments, they're scratching their heads as to what to do. They're recognizing at this point that we've got some major problems in our society, and what we're doing is not working. We need to figure out what we can do to come together as a community, either locally or globally, in order to solve these problems, because if we don't, we're definitely headed down a road to disaster.
All right, and you can see here Mike Pompeo, he goes to the Vatican there and basically calling on the Pope, wanting, it appears, to get the Vatican on their side, as we see, with certain other meetings with the Pope between different leaders, that the United States and the Vatican, they seem to have very close ties. They almost want to be, joined together on a lot of the same issues, and the Pope always has his hand there actually in helping make some of these pretty big decisions there that the nations carry out.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, if it does, because, that request in itself could be a cause for division with other religions who don't recognize the Vatican or the Holy See, and so they may have a different means to which they look to, solving problems. So, it'll be interesting because the Pope and the Catholic Church has stepped on a lot of people's toes, in the last several hundred years. And of course, a lot has come out in the news regarding the sexual abuse, the banking scandals, things like that have taken place in Rome. And so it's kind of left a bad taste in the minds of even in the mouths of even Catholics in regards to looking to the Vatican as a intercessor for the problems that we're facing right now. Well, if you are interested in finding solutions to your problems and would like to know what the Holy Scriptures actually show, contact the House of Yahweh and find out what the teachings of the House of Yahweh as presented by Yisrael Hawkins has to say about those things. And when you contact the House of Yahweh, of course, don't forget to request your free copy of the Prophetic Word magazine and the monthly newsletter. Here's how.
To contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at the House of Yahweh, P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can call them at 1-800-613-9494. Visit them on any of their websites by going to yahweh.com, yisraelhawkins.com, or yahwehsbranch.com. You can also visit our website by going to ypnnews.com. If you would like to email the House of Yahweh, you can email them at info@yahweh.com. Any calls coming internationally, you can call the number that's on your screen now. And once again, don't forget to check out 2 absolutely free study tools on the market today to help you answer all your scriptural questions. The Yisrael Says program by going to yisraelsays.com, and the Ask Yisrael program by going to askyisrael.com.
Well, don't go anywhere. Make sure you have your paper, your pencils, and your Holy Scriptures, because up next, Yisrael Hawkins. For all of us here at YPN News, I'm Katan Alexander.
And I'm Jeffrey Heimerman.
Thank you for watching.